Welcome to another episode of the Midnight Investigator, where we take another alternative look at moments in history. It's said he killed 10 men single-handed in one night. It's said he killed 100 men across his lifetime, maybe more. It's said he fathered a child with Calamity Jane and walked through the frontier like a man who couldn't be touched. Movies turned him into the template, the fearless anti-hero, the man of action, the gunfighter who never flinches. Okay, so we're delving into the story of the legendary Wild Bill Hickok and asking a simple question. Does the myth actually fit the man? Or did the legend get written first and the facts forced to follow? Because the real question isn't whether these stories are dramatic. The real question is who started them, who benefited, and how a man can become famous for things that may never have happened while he's still alive. In this episode, we separate the myth from the evidence. James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, wasn't just a gunman in a violent time. He became a frontier celebrity in his own lifetime, known as a soldier, scout, lawman, gambler, and showman, with a reputation that grew louder with every retelling. The problem is, a lot of that reputation was boosted by stories that were exaggerated, distorted, or flat-out invented, sometimes by writers, sometimes by Hickok himself. That's why he's perfect for a myth versus evidence investigation. He was born on May 27, 1837, in Homer, Illinois, in what's now Troy Grove. He was raised on a farm in northern Illinois, in an era when the line between law and vigilante justice could be thin, and where local violence and criminal groups were part of the background noise. His father, William Alonzo Hickok, was known as an abolitionist, and later accounts say the family home was used as a stop on the Underground Railroad. When his father died in 1852, James was only 15, and whatever stability existed at home didn't last forever. Even as a teenager, Hickok gained a local reputation for being an exceptional shot, especially with a pistol. Photographs often make people assume he was dark-haired, but contemporaries described him differently, including claims that he had red hair. Either way, the image was forming early. A young man with a weapon, with ability, and with a growing sense that his story didn't have to stay in Illinois. In 1855, at the age of 18, Hickok left after a fight with a man named Charles Hudson. Both men fell into a canal, and each mistakenly believed he'd killed the other. Whether it was fear, shame, or plain survival instinct, Hickok fled west and landed in Leavenworth in the Kansas Territory, stepping straight into a world that was already boiling over. Kansas at that moment wasn't just the frontier, it was a battleground. Hickok joined Jim Lane's Free State Army, also known as the Jayhawkers, an anti-slavery vigilante group active during the Bleeding Kansas years. It's also where he crossed paths with a young William Cody, later to become Buffalo Bill, who was still a boy at the time but already moving in the same rough orbit of scouts, fighters, and men who would later sell the West back to America as a legend. And that's the key thing to clock right now. Before the famous gunfights, before the newspaper stories, before the myth exploded, Hickok's early life is already a mix of violence, politics, and performance. He didn't just move west. He moved into the kind of world where reputations were currency and where a story could protect you as much as a gun. Before he became known as Wild Bill, Hickok's name wasn't even consistent. From 1858, he sometimes used his late father's name, William Hickok, and during the Civil War, he also went by William Haycock. For years, many newspapers called him Haycock, and one major article even misspelled his surname as Hitchcock. The legend was spreading faster than the facts, and even his identity got muddled. He also picked up nicknames early. In Nebraska, one man mocked him as Duck Bill, a jab at his long nose. Then came the McCannells incident at Rock Creek Station in 1861, where a payment dispute ended in gunfire and 3 men were killed. After that, Hickok grew a mustache, and by the same year he began calling himself Wild Bill, a name that worked like a frontier brand, designed to travel ahead of him. By the late 1850s, he was already building a life on the edge of the frontier. He claimed land in Kansas, was elected a township constable in 1858, and later joined the Russell, Majors, and Waddell Freight Company, linked to the Pony Express. This was the world of stage routes, freight teams, and rough towns, where reputation mattered and violence wasn't rare. In 1860, Hickok claimed he was mauled by a bear while driving a freight team towards Santa Fe, and that he killed it at close range after being crushed and badly injured. He was reportedly bedridden for months with serious injuries, then sent to Rock Creek Station in the Nebraska Territory to work as a stable hand while recovering. On July 12, 1861, A man named David McCannels came to Rock Creek Station demanding an overdue payment from the manager, Horace Wellman. What happened next is disputed, but McCannels was shot and killed, along with 2 men with him. Hickok, Wellman, and another employee were tried and found to have acted in self-defense. If so, this may have been the first killing linked to Hickok, and it became one of the key moments later writers used to build his legend. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Hickok didn't step into a glamorous combat role. He worked for the Union as a teamster in Sedalia, Missouri, and by the end of that year he'd become a wagon master. In September 1862, he was discharged for reasons that aren't clear, then later turned up again connected to Jim Lane's Kansas Brigade, where he crossed paths with Buffalo Bill Cody. After that, his war work drifts into a grayer zone, with later claims ranging from scouting to undercover roles, but the paper trail doesn't match the legend. By late 1863, he was working around southwest Missouri under the provost marshal system, doing unglamorous enforcement jobs, the kind that never make it into movies. He was also broke for long stretches of time, and by 1865 he was scouting under General John B. Sanborn, then mustered out and went to Springfield, where he fell into gambling and reputation building. One local history later described him in harsh terms, painting him as a loud, swaggering menace when drunk. Whether that's fair or exaggerated, it shows how divided opinions about him were, even while he was alive. Okay, so Springfield is where the legend really catches fire for real. In July 1865, Hickok and a gambler, Davis Tutt, turned a gambling debt into a public showdown, with a gold watch as the spark. On July 21, 1865, they faced off in the town square and fired. Tutt inadvertently missed. Hickok, on the other hand, hit him through the heart from a long distance, and Tutt collapsed. Hickok was arrested, tried, and ultimately acquitted, with the idea of a fair fight hanging over the outcome, even as the verdict caused backlash. Then the myth machine went into overdrive. A Harper's Monthly piece soon after featured Hickok in the voice of a larger-than-life killer, crediting him with hundreds of deaths and stacking the story with dramatic flourishes. It made him famous, but it also triggered rebuttals from frontier papers, who said the article didn't match reality. This is one of the clearest points where you can actually see the legend being manufactured on the page. After Springfield, Hickok moved into official roles that put him directly in the path of violence. He became a deputy U.S. Marshal based around Fort Riley, Kansas, and sometimes worked as a scout in the wider conflict and chaos of the era. There are real incidents where witnesses confirm he was attacked while scouting and did shoot back. But there are also cases where his own newspaper claims ballooned beyond what other witnesses said happened. That pattern becomes important, a core of truth surrounded by exaggeration. By 1868 and 1869, he was in and around Hays City, Kansas, working as a deputy marshal and then elected city marshal and sheriff of Ellis County. Hays was volatile, and Hickok's tenure quickly became bloody. In September 1869, he killed Bill Mulvey, but only after Mulvey had rampaged through the town drunk and had made threats to kill him. Later that month, he killed a cowboy named Samuel Strawhan during a late-night saloon disturbance. Inquests ruled the shootings justifiable, but the evidence was described as contradictory, and the controversy followed him. In July 1870, he was attacked by cavalry troopers in a saloon. One gun misfired in his ear, and Hickok killed one man and wounded another. He kept losing re-election fights, and the message was clear. Even when he was the law, people weren't always comfortable with how he enforced it. In 1871, Hickok became Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, hired to tame a cattle town that had a habit of chewing up lawmen. This is where he crosses paths with John Wesley Hardin, a young Texas gunfighter already building a terrifying reputation, later claiming he'd killed dozens of men. Hardin would go on to write his own story in a way that made him sound untouchable, so the line between Hardin's self-mythology and Hickok's reality gets muddy fast. He later claimed a close relationship and dramatic episodes with Hickok, but he was known to exaggerate, and Hickok's own accounts don't always match the folklore that grew around those months. Abilene ends with the moment that breaks the invincible gunman image. Hickok got into a feud with saloon owner Phil Coe, and on October 5, 1871, Coe fired shots during a street disturbance. Hickok shot Coe, but in the split-second chaos he also fired at a figure running toward him and accidentally killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, who was coming to help. Both men died, and Hickok was haunted by it. Less than 2 months later, he was relieved of his duties, and after that, the famous gunfights fade away. The legend keeps growing, but the man's violent, active chapter is already closing. After Abilene, the story takes a hard left turn from blood and dust frontier to something almost into a tragic comedy. In 1872, Hickok tried to cash in on the public image by staging an outdoor spectacle at Niagara Falls called the Daring Buffalo Chase of the Plains. He brought in 6 Native Americans and 3 cowboys and tried to sell the Wild West back to the East as entertainment. But because it was outdoors, he couldn't force people to pay, and the whole venture bled money. Now, I'm not sure what on earth he was thinking, but the show turned into outright chaotic. The show included buffaloes, a bear, and even a monkey, and during one performance, a buffalo refused to play along. Hickok fired a shot into the sky to push it into motion, which understandably frightened the animals and panicked the crowd. The buffaloes smashed through the fencing and chased the audience, and people were hurt in the scramble. It's almost unbelievable, and it's the sort of publicity that Hickok didn't need. Undeterred, he joined Buffalo Bill Cody and Texas Jack Omohundro in their stage show in 1873. On paper, it sounds perfect. 3 famous names selling the frontier's theater. In reality, Hickok didn't enjoy acting, and he didn't want the attention. Accounts say he sometimes hid behind scenery, and in one show, he even shot the spotlight when it focused on him. After a few months, he was out. The living legend couldn't stand being looked at. One reason keeps appearing in the background of these years, and it matters. Hickok's eyesight was fading. From around 1871 until his death, multiple accounts described serious vision problems, and people close to him said bright lights made it worse. Eye disease was common on the frontier, and by 1876 he traveled to Kansas City seeking treatment from a specialist. No definitive diagnosis survives, but the bottom line is simple. The man who built a reputation on precision and nerve was losing the one thing that made both possible. By 1876, despite still gambling and still trying to stay afloat, he was sliding. His health and marksmanship were said to be in decline, and he was even arrested at times for vagrancy. That detail is easy to miss, but it's telling. Fame doesn't always come with security. Sometimes it just comes with an audience that expects you to keep performing. Then comes the part nobody expects. Hickok met Agnes Thatcherlake back in 1871. She was older than him, a widow, and the proprietor of a circus. They stayed in contact for years, and on March 5, 1876, he married her in Cheyenne. It should have been the end of the wandering. Instead, within months, he left again, joining a wagon train, chasing one last fortune in the gold fields of the Black Hills. Shortly before his death, he wrote Agnes a letter that reads like a man who can feel the end approaching. It's romantic, yes, but it's also eerie. He talks as if he might not see her again, and as if he already knows he's walking towards something he can't step away from. And this is where the Calamity Jane myth tries to force its way back into the story. Jane later claimed she had married Hickok and divorced him so he could marry Agnes, but no records support it. The more likely truth is simpler and stranger. She may have met him only later, around the wagon train period, and the rest became legend after the fact. 2 famous names, one tragic ending, and a public that wanted a romance badly enough to invent one. On August 1, 1876, Hickok was in Deadwood, playing poker at Nuttall and Mann Saloon. A drunk drifter named Jack McCall sat in on the game and lost heavily. Hickok told him to quit until he could cover his losses, then offered him money for breakfast. McCall took the money, but it also seems he took it as an insult. The next day, Hickok returned to the same game, and the small details turned fatal. He normally sat with his back to a wall so he could watch the door, but the only open seat faced away from it. He asked twice to swap seats. He was refused. A short time later, McCall walked in behind him, raised a Colt .45, and shot Hickok in the back of the head at point-blank range. Hickok died instantly, and the shot even injured another man as the bullet carried on. Afterward, the legend latched onto the cards. People said Hickok was holding black aces and black eights when he was killed, the hand that became known as the dead man's hand. But even that famous detail comes with a shadow, because the identity of the 5th card has been argued ever since, and accounts differ on the exact game being played. McCall's motive has never settled into a single clean answer. The simplest explanation is pride and revenge over the breakfast money. McCall later claimed he was avenging a brother supposedly killed by Hickok. But whether that brother story was even true remains uncertain, and it muddied the waters from the start. His first trial was held in Deadwood before an informal miners' jury, and McCall was acquitted. But he couldn't keep quiet. After he bragged about killing Hickok, he was rearrested by US authorities. And this time the case was moved to Yankton, the territorial capital. McCall was found guilty and sentenced to death. So okay, what about the stories? Because by the time he died in Deadwood, he wasn't just a man. He was a headline. A character. A legend that had been printed, repeated, and sold so many times that people stopped asking what was true and started arguing over which version they liked best. Okay, let's start with Rock Creek Station, the myth factory moment. The legend says Hickok fought off a gang alone and killed 10 men single-handed. But the defensible core is smaller and darker. 3 men died in that incident: McCannels, Woods, and Gordon, and many accounts say they were unarmed when they were shot. Whether every detail is settled or not, the 10-man battle reads like pure inflation. Rock Creek wasn't where he became superhuman. Rock Creek is where the story learned it could grow without limits. Then there's the body count myth. People repeated that he killed hundreds, or over 100 men, and it became part of the brand. But when you strip away the bravado and the newspaper hype, that number collapses into a handful of fatal shootings tied to him, not a mountain of bodies. The legend wasn't counting the dead. It was building a reputation. Even the most famous detail of his death has a shadow. The dead man's hand is usually presented like a confirmed fact, but the truth is, the story tightened over time. Aces and eights became the accepted version later, and the 5th card is still debated. The detail everyone knows is the kind of detail folklore loves. Clean, dramatic, and just uncertain enough to survive forever. And the legend demanded a romance. Calamity Jane later claimed she and Hickok were secretly married and had a child, but there's no solid record to back it up, and the claim is heavily disputed. It's another example of how fame works. 2 famous names get stitched together because it feels right, not because it's true. In the end, the most dangerous thing in Hickok's life wasn't a gun. It was the story. Because the story didn't just follow him, it outgrew him, outran him, and finally trapped him inside a version of himself he could never fully control. Beneath the headlines and the tall stories, he was still just a man. A working frontier survivor. Sometimes brave, sometimes reckless, sometimes lucky, sometimes wrong. And like most men of his time, he carried scars you don't see in dime novels: failing health, fading eyesight, and the slow weight of everything he'd been forced to do and everything people insisted he must have done. And that's the strange victory, too. Hickok died in Deadwood, but Wild Bill didn't. The legend kept moving long after the man stopped. Not always for the right reasons, not always on the truth, but on what people wanted to believe about the West. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Fame doesn't need accuracy. It needs a story that sticks. Hickok became famous in his own lifetime, and in the end he became a victim of the very reputation that made him, his own fame. Okay, definitely one of my all-time favorite folk heroes. So you've been watching The Midnight Investigator. If this story interested you, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. We'll be back with more investigations soon. In the meantime, question everything. Don't let someone else do your thinking.